A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume. Book 3 of Morals. Part 2 of Justice and Injustice. Section 10 of the Objects of Allegiance. But though on some occasions it may be justified, both in sound politics and morality, to resist supreme power, 'tis certain that in the ordinary course of human affairs nothing can be more pernicious and criminal, and that besides the convulsions which always attend revolutions, such a practice tends directly to the subversion of all government, and the causing a universal anarchy and confusion among mankind. As numerous and civilized societies cannot subsist without government, so government is entirely useless without an exact obedience. We ought always to weigh the advantages which we reap from authority against the disadvantages, and by this means we shall become more scrupulous of putting in practice the doctrine of resistance. The common rule requires submission, and 'tis only in cases of grievous tyranny and oppression that the exception can take place. Since then such a blind submission is commonly due to magistracy, the next question is to whom it is due, and whom we are to regard as our lawful magistrates. In order to answer this question let us recollect what we have already established concerning the origin of government and political society. When men have once experienced the impossibility of preserving any steady order in society, while everyone is his own master and violates or observes the laws of society according to his present interest or pleasure, they naturally run into the invention of government, and put it out of their own power, as far as possible, to transgress the laws of society. Government therefore arises from the voluntary convention of men, and 'tis evident that the same convention which establishes government will also determine the persons who are to govern, and will remove all doubt and ambiguity in this particular. And the voluntary consent of men must here have the greater efficacy, that the authority of the magistrate does at first stand upon the foundation of a promise of the subjects, by which they bind themselves to obedience, as in every other contract or engagement. The same promise then which binds them to obedience ties them down to a particular person, and makes him the object of their allegiance. But when government has been established on this footing for some considerable time, and the separate interest which we have in submission has produced a separate sentiment of morality, the case is entirely altered, and a promise is no longer able to determine the particular magistrate, since it is no longer considered as the foundation of government. We naturally suppose ourselves born to submission, and imagine that such particular persons have a right to command, as we on our part are bound to obey. These notions of right and obligation are derived from nothing but the advantage we reap from government, which gives us a repugnance to practice resistance ourselves, and makes us displeased with any instance of it in others. But here 'tis remarkable that in this new state of affairs the original sanction of government, which is interest, is not admitted to determine the persons whom we are to obey, as the original sanction did at first, when affairs were on the footing of a promise. A promise fixes and determines the persons, without any uncertainty, but 'tis evident that if men were to regulate their conduct, in this particular, by the view of a peculiar interest, either public or private, they would involve themselves in endless confusion, and would render all government, in a great measure, ineffectual. The private interest of every one is different, and though the public interest in itself be always one and the same, yet it becomes the source of as great dissensions, by reason of the different opinions of particular persons concerning it. The same interest, therefore, which causes us to submit to magistracy, makes us renounce itself in the choice of our magistrates, and binds us down to a certain form of government and to particular persons without allowing us to aspire to the utmost perfection in either. The case is here the same as in the law of nature concerning the stability of possession. 'Tis highly advantageous, and even absolutely necessary to society, that possession should be stable, and this leads us to the establishment of such a rule, but we find that were we to follow the same advantage in assigning particular possessions to particular persons, we should disappoint our end, and perpetuate the confusion which that rule is intended to prevent. We must therefore proceed by general rules, and regulate ourselves by general interests, in modifying the law of nature concerning the stability of possession. Nor need we fear that our attachment to this law will diminish upon account of the seeming frivolousness of those interests by which it is determined. The impulse of the mind is derived from a very strong interest, and those other more minute interests serve only to direct the motion, without adding anything to it, or diminishing from it. 'Tis the same case with government. Nothing is more advantageous to society than such an invention, and this interest is sufficient to make us embrace it with ardor and alacrity, though we are obliged afterwards to regulate and direct our devotion to government by several considerations, which are not of the same importance, and to choose our magistrates without having in view any particular advantage from the choice. The first of those principles I shall take notice of, as a foundation of the right of magistracy, is that which gives authority to all the most established governments of the world without exception. I mean long possession in any one form of government or succession of princes. 'Tis certain that if we remount to the first origin of every nation, we shall find that there scarce is any race of kings, or form of commonwealth, that is not primarily founded on usurpation and rebellion, and whose title is not first worse than doubtful and uncertain. Time alone gives solidity to their right, and operating gradually on the minds of men, reconciles them to any authority, and makes it seem just and reasonable. Nothing causes any sentiment to have a greater influence upon us than custom, or turns our imagination more strongly to any object. When we have been long accustomed to obey any set of men, that general instinct or tendency, which we have to suppose a moral obligation attending loyalty, takes easily this direction, and chooses that set of men for its objects. 'Tis interest which gives the general instinct, but 'tis custom which gives the particular direction. And here 'tis observable that the same length of time has a different influence on our sentiments of morality, according to its different influence on the mind. We naturally judge of everything by comparison, and since in the considering the fate of kingdoms and republics we embrace a long extent of time, a small duration has not in this case a like influence on our sentiments as when we consider any other object. One thinks he acquires a right to a horse or a suit of clothes in a very short time, but a century is scarce sufficient to establish any new government, or remove all scruples in the mind of the subjects concerning it. Add to this that a shorter period of time will suffice to give a prince a title to any additional power he may usurp, than will serve to fix his right where the whole is a usurpation. The kings of France have not been possessed of absolute power for about 2 reigns, and yet nothing will appear more extravagant to Frenchmen than to talk of their liberties. If we consider what has been said concerning ascension, we shall easily account for this phenomenon. When there is no form of government established by long possession, the present possession is sufficient to supply its place, and may be regarded as the second source of all public authority. Right to authority is nothing but the constant possession of authority maintained by the laws of society in the interests of mankind, and nothing can be more natural than to join this constant possession to the present one, according to the principles above mentioned. If the same principles did not take place with regard to the property of private persons, 'twas because these principles were counterbalanced by very strong considerations of interest. When we observe that all restitution would by that means be prevented, and every violence be authorized and protected, and though the same motives may seem to have force with regard to public authority, yet they are opposed by a contrary interest, which consists in the preservation of peace, and the avoiding of all changes, which, however they may be easily produced in private affairs, are unavoidably intended with bloodshed and confusion where the public is interested. Anyone who finding the impossibility of accounting for the right of the present possessor by any received system of ethics should resolve to deny absolutely that right and assert that it is not authorized by morality, would be justly thought to maintain a very extravagant paradox, and to shock the common sense and judgment of mankind. No maxim is more conformable both to prudence and morals than to submit quietly to the government which we find established in the country where we happen to live, without inquiring too curiously into its origin and first establishment. Few governments will bear being examined so rigorously. How many kingdoms are there at present in the world, and how many more do we find in history, whose governors have no better foundation for their authority than that of present possession? To confine ourselves to the Roman and Grecian Empire, is it not evident that the long succession of emperors, from the dissolution of the Roman liberty to the final extinction of that empire by the Turks, could not so much as pretend to any other title of the empire? The election of the Senate was a mere form, which always followed the choice of the legions, and these were almost always divided in the different provinces, and nothing but the sword was able to terminate the difference. 'Twas by the sword, therefore, that every emperor acquired as well as defended his right, and we must either say that all the known world for so many ages had no government, and owed no allegiance to any one, or must allow that the right of the stronger in public affairs is to be received as legitimate, and authorized by morality, when not opposed by any other title. The right of conquest may be considered as a third source of the title of sovereigns. This right resembles very much that of present possession, but is rather a superior force, being seconded by the notions of glory and honor, which we ascribe to conquerors, instead of the sentiments of hatred and detestation, which attend usurpers. Men naturally favor those they love, and therefore are more apt to ascribe a right to successful violence betwixt one sovereign and another, than to the successful rebellion of a subject against his sovereign. When neither long possession nor present possession nor conquest take place, as when the first sovereign who founded any monarchy dies, in that case the right of succession naturally prevails in their stead, and men are commonly induced to place the son of their late monarch on the throne and suppose him to inherit his father's authority. The presumed consent of the father, the imitation of the succession to private families, the interest which the state has in choosing the person who is most powerful and has the most numerous followers, all these reasons lead men to prefer the son of their late monarch than any other person. These reasons have some weight, but I am persuaded that to one who considers impartially of the matter, 'twill appear that there concur some principles of the imagination, along with those views of interest. The royal authority seems to be connected with the young prince even in his father's lifetime, by the natural transition of the thought, and still more after his death, so that nothing is more natural than to complete this union by a new relation and by putting him actually in possession of what seems so naturally to belong to him. To confirm this we may weigh the following phenomena, which are pretty curious in their kind. In elective monarchies, the right of succession has no place by the laws of settled custom, and yet its influence is so natural that 'tis impossible entirely to exclude it from the imagination, and render the subjects indifferent to the son of their deceased monarch. Hence in some governments of this kind the choice commonly falls on one or other of the royal family, and in some governments they are all excluded. Those contrary phenomena proceed from the same principle, where the royal family is excluded. 'Tis from a refinement in politics which makes people sensible of their propensity to choose a sovereign in that family, and gives them a jealousy of their liberty, lest their new monarch, aided by this propensity, should establish his family, and destroy the freedom of elections for the future. The history of Artaxerxes and the younger Cyrus may furnish us with some reflections to the same purpose. Cyrus pretended a right to the throne above his elder brother, because he was born after his father's accession. I do not pretend that this reason was valid, I would only infer from it that he would never have made use of such a pretext were it not for the qualities of the imagination above mentioned, by which we are naturally inclined to unite by a new relation whatever objects we find already united. Artaxerxes had an advantage above his brother, as being the eldest son, and the first in succession, but Cyrus was more closely related to the royal authority, as being begot after his father was invested with it. Should it here be pretended that the view of convenience may be the source of all the right of succession, and that men gladly take advantage of any rule, by which they can fix the successor of their late sovereign, and pretend that anarchy and confusion which attends all new elections. To this I would answer, that I readily allow, that this motive may contribute something to the effect, but at the same time I assert, that without another principle, 'tis impossible such a motive should take place. The interest of a nation requires that the succession to the crown should be fixed one way or other, but 'tis the same thing to its interest in what way it be fixed, so that if the relation of blood had not an effect independent of public interest, it would never have been regarded without a positive law, and 'twould have been impossible that so many positive laws of different nations could ever have concurred precisely in the same views and intentions. This leads us to consider the fifth source of authority, positive laws, when the legislature establishes a certain form of government and succession of princes. At first sight it may be thought that this must resolve into some of the preceding titles of authority. The legislative power whence the positive law is derived must either be established by original contract, long possession, present possession, conquest, or succession, and consequently the positive law must derive its force from some of those principles. But here 'tis remarkable, that though a positive law can only derive its force from these principles, yet it acquires not all the force of the principle from whence it is derived, but loses considerably in the transition, as it is natural to imagine. For instance, a government is established for many centuries on a certain system of laws, forms, and methods of succession. The legislative power, established by this long succession, changes all on a sudden the whole system of government, and introduces a new constitution in its stead. I believe few of the subjects will think themselves bound to comply with this alteration, unless it have an evident tendency to the public good, but will think themselves still at liberty to return to the ancient government. Hence the notion of fundamental laws, which are supposed to be inalterable by the will of the sovereign, and of this nature the Salic law is understood to be in France. How far these fundamental laws extend is not determined in any government, nor is it possible it ever should. There is such an insensible gradation from the most material laws to the most trivial, and from the most ancient laws to the most modern, that 'twill be impossible to set bounds to the legislative power, and determine how far it may innovate in the principles of government. That is the work more of imagination and passion than of reason. Whoever considers the history of the several nations of the world, their revolutions, conquests, increase, and diminution, the manner in which their particular governments are established, and the successive right transmitted from one person to another, will soon learn to treat very lightly all disputes concerning the rights of princes, and will be convinced that a strict adherence to any general rules, and the rigid loyalty to particular persons and families, on which some people set so high a value, are virtues that hold less of reason than of bigotry and superstition. In this particular the study of history confirms the reasonings of true philosophy, which, showing us the original qualities of human nature, teaches us to regard the controversies in politics as incapable of any decision in most cases, and as entirely subordinate to the interests of peace and liberty, where the public good does not evidently demand a change. 'Tis certain that the concurrence of all those titles, original contract, long possession, present possession, succession, and positive laws, forms the strongest title to sovereignty, and is justly regarded as sacred and inviolable. But when these titles are mingled and opposed in different degrees, they often occasion perplexity, and are less capable of solution from the arguments of lawyers and philosophers than from the swords of the soldiery. Who shall tell me, for instance, whether Germanicus or Drusus ought to have succeeded Tiberius, had he died while they were both alive, without naming any of them for his successor? Ought the right of adoption to be received as equivalent to that of blood in a nation, where it had the same effect in private families, and had already, in two instances, taken place in the public? Ought Germanicus to be esteemed the eldest son, because he was born before Drusus, or the younger because he was adopted after the birth of his brother. Ought the right of the elder to be regarded in a nation where the eldest brother had no advantage in the succession of private families? Ought the Roman Empire at that time to be esteemed hereditary because of two examples, or ought it, even so early, to be regarded as belonging to the stronger, or the present possessor as being founded on so recent a usurpation? Upon whatever principles we may pretend to answer these and such like questions, I am afraid we shall never be able to satisfy an impartial inquirer who adopts no party in political controversies, and will be satisfied with nothing but sound reason and philosophy. But here an English reader will be apt to inquire concerning that famous revolution, which has had such a happy influence on our Constitution, and has been attended with such mighty consequences. We have already remarked that in the case of enormous tyranny and oppression, 'tis lawful to take arms even against supreme power, and that as government is a mere human invention for mutual advantage and security, it no longer imposes any obligation, either natural or moral, when once it ceases to have that tendency. But though this general principle be authorized by common sense and the practice of all ages, 'tis certainly impossible for the laws, or even for philosophy, to establish any particular rules, by which we may know when resistance is lawful, and decide all controversies which may arise on that subject. This may not only happen with regard to supreme power, but 'tis possible even in some constitutions where the legislative authority is not lodged in one person, that there may be a magistrate so eminent and powerful as to oblige the laws to keep silent in this particular. Nor would this silence be an effect only of their respect, but also of their prudence, since 'tis certain that in the vast variety of circumstances which occur in all governments, an exercise of power is so great a magistrate may at one time be beneficial to the public, which at another time would be pernicious and tyrannical. But notwithstanding this silence of the laws in limited monarchies, 'tis certain that the people still retain the right of resistance, since 'tis impossible, even in the most despotic governments, to deprive them of it. The same necessity of self-preservation and the same motive of public good give them the same liberty in the one case as in the other, and we may farther observe that in such mixed governments the cases where the resistance is lawful must occur much oftener, and greater indulgence be given to the subjects to defend themselves by force of arms, than in arbitrary governments. Not only where the chief magistrate enters into measures, in themselves extremely pernicious to the public, but even when he would encroach on the other parts of the Constitution, and extend his power beyond the legal bounds, it is allowable to resist and dethrone him, though such resistance and violence may, in the general tenor of the laws, be deemed unlawful and rebellious. For besides that nothing is more essential to public interest than the preservation of public liberty, 'tis evident that if such a mixed government be once supposed to establish, every part or member of the Constitution must have a right of self-defense, and of maintaining its ancient bounds against the encroachment of every other authority, as matters would have been created in vain, were it deprived of a power of resistance, without which no part of it could preserve a distinct existence, and the whole might be crowded up into a single point. So 'tis a gross absurdity to suppose, in any government, a right without a remedy, or allow that the supreme power is shared with the people, without allowing that 'tis lawful for them to defend their share against every invader. Those, therefore, who would seem to respect our free government, and yet deny the right of resistance, have renounced all pretensions to common sense, and do not merit a serious answer. It does not belong to my present purpose to show that these general principles are applicable to the late Revolution, and that all the rights and privileges which ought to be sacred to a free nation were at that time threatened with the utmost danger. I am better pleased to leave this controverted subject, if it really admits of controversy, and to indulge myself in some philosophical reflections which naturally arise from that important event. First, we may observe that should the Lords and Commons in our Constitution, without any reason from public interest, either depose the king in being, or after his death exclude the prince, who by laws and settled custom ought to succeed. No one would esteem their proceedings legal, or think themselves bound to comply with them. But should the king, by his unjust practices or his attempts for tyrannical and despotic power, justly forfeit his legal, it then not only becomes morally lawful and suitable to the nature of political society to dethrone him, but what is more, we are apt likewise to think that the remaining members of the Constitution acquire a right of excluding his next heir, and of choosing whom they please for his successor. This is founded on a very singular quality of our thought and imagination. When a king forfeits his authority, his heir ought naturally to remain in the same situation, as if the king were removed by death, unless by mixing himself in the tyranny, he forfeited for himself. But though this may seem reasonable, we easily comply with the contrary opinion. The disposition of a king in such a government as ours is certainly an act beyond all common authority, and an illegal assuming a power for public good, which, in the ordinary course of government, can belong to no member of the Constitution. When the public good is so great and so evident as to justify the action, the commendable use of this license causes us naturally to attribute to the Parliament a right of using farther licenses, and the ancient bounds of the laws being once transgressed with approbation, we are not apt to be so strict in confining ourselves precisely within their limits. The mind naturally runs on with any train of action which it has begun, nor do we commonly make any scruple concerning our duty, after the first action of any kind, which we perform. Thus at the Revolution no one who thought the deposition of the father justifiable esteemed themselves to be confined to his infant son, though had that unhappy monarch died innocent at that time, and had his son by any accident been conveyed beyond seas, there is no doubt but a regency would have been appointed till he should come to age, and could be restored to his dominions. As the slightest properties of the imagination have an effect on the judgments of the people, it shows the wisdom of the laws and of the Parliament to take advantage of such properties, and choose the magistrates either in or out of a line, according as the vulgar will most naturally attribute authority and right to them. Secondly, though the accession of the Prince of Orange to the throne might at first give occasion to many disputes, and his title be contested, it ought not now to appear doubtful, but must have acquired a sufficient authority from those three princes who have succeeded him upon the same title. Nothing is more usual, though nothing may at first sight appear more unreasonable than this way of thinking. Princes often seem to acquire a right from their successors, as well as from their ancestors. A king, who during his lifetime might justly be deemed a usurper, will be regarded by posterity as a lawful prince, because he has had the good fortune to settle his family on the throne, and entirely change the ancient form of government. Julius Caesar is regarded as the first Roman emperor, while Sylla and Marius, whose titles were really the same as his, are treated as tyrants and usurpers. Time and custom give authority to all forms of government, and all successions of princes, and that power which at first was founded only on injustice and violence, becomes in time legal and obligatory. Nor does the mind rest there, but returning back upon its footsteps, transfers to their predecessors and ancestors that right which it naturally ascribes to the posterity, as being related together and united in the imagination. The present King of France makes Hugh Capet a more lawful prince than Cromwell, as the established liberty of the Dutch is no inconsiderable apology for their obstinate resistance to Philip II.